Hi, friends. Welcome to Haftarah study. It's good to see you on this beautiful Sunday afternoon in Corvallis. It's absolutely gorgeous out there. As I was telling Leah and Tali before Margaret and Amy, you arrived, apologize for not wearing a collar like I usually do. You're going to have to settle for sweaty t-shirt Torah today. I was outside building some raised beds for the garden because that's what you do in Oregon when it's the first nice day of the spring. Want to give a quick brief intro shtick about what it is, how our learning is going to be structured this afternoon. So we've been going through the Haftarah of the year. Briefly about what Haftarah is, that comes from what I like to call the Nach, the rest of the Tanakh, the Torah, Nevi'im and Ketuvim, or the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, Nevi'im, the prophets, and Ketuvim, the writings. So these are selections from the Nach, and usually there's a thematic connection to the Torah portion of the week, or some kind of relevance to the occasion. Frequently, I find it's when people fall asleep in shul because it's often in Hebrew. Even if you know Hebrew, even if you don't know the Hebrew, the translation is usually pretty opaque. It's seldom the topic of the drash. It's kind of hard to really understand what it is, why we're reading it, what's going on. So it's kind of fun to delve into this kind of underappreciated part of the synagogue readings. There are a lot of theories about how reading Haftarah selections got started, but what matters for our purposes here is that these were consciously selected as the readings to go along with the various parshiot, which means that somebody picked this on purpose for a reason, because it spoke to them. So as we learn about what's in here and start to think about and process it, we're going to ask ourselves a little bit, how can it speak to us? How maybe has it spoken to others in the past, and how does it speak to us now? I also always take a little bit of license with what we choose to focus on here. Since we've been doing these on Sunday, frequently I actually end up reading last week's Haftarah portion, which is what I'm going to do this week. Actually, we've already done both Tazria Metzora, which is last Shabbat's Torah portion, and Kedoshim, which is next week's Torah portion. So we're going to do the Haftarah for Tazria. That's a long way of saying we're going to do the Haftarah for Tazria. Last year we did the Haftarah for Metzora. So those are actually two very, we'll say, difficult parshiot in the Torah, Tazria and Metzora. I'll go over a little bit what's in there, but they actually have some really good Haftarah associated with them. So I'm kind of excited for this. So I'll give you a little bit of a Torah portion summary. We'll go over some background to the book that our Haftarah comes from, and then we'll dive in and read and kind of see what comes up. Okay. So here's a summary, a little bit of what happens in Parashat Tazria. So Tazria and Metzora are two parshiot in the book of Leviticus that are frequently combined. Most non-leap years, you read Tazria and Metzora as a combined portion, partially because they're just not that long, and also partially because there's not a lot of action. Over the course of these two parshiot, God describes the rituals for purification for a woman after childbirth. These all have to do with ritual purity and impurity. God sets out methods for diagnosing and treating a variety of skin diseases, including something the Torah calls tzara'at, which often gets mistranslated as leprosy. It's definitely not leprosy, I don't think, but we also don't know exactly what it is. So I'll try to call it tzara'at as much as I can. It goes over the priestly rituals to cure somebody from tzara'at when it afflicts humans. There's also, the reason we don't think it's leprosy is tzara'at is also described as afflicting houses, buildings. So there's also rituals for ridding dwelling places of tzara'at. Talks about male impurities resulting from nocturnal emissions, and concludes with accounts of female impurities caused by menstruation. So riveting stuff. I have a special connection to Parashat Metzora in particular because I read it at my bar mitzvah, and also again right before my wedding. It was the portion I read at my ufruv. So I can't escape this one, but I think that that just makes me want to dig even deeper each time I come upon it and dig up a little bit more. So our Haftarah for Parashat Tazria, and normally I should tell you when a double portion is read, the Haftarah is just the second of the two. So normally when you do Tazria Metzora, you read Metzora's Haftarah in synagogue. So we're going to study one that wouldn't actually have been read in most synagogues this past week. So it comes from the book of 2 Kings and starts in chapter 4 with verse 42 and goes into chapter 5, verse 19. So if you're looking at following along in a Chumash, just turn to Parashat Tazria. And if you have a Tanakh in front of you, you can turn to 2 Kings chapter 4. I will also put all the text up on the screen, so you don't need anything in front of you either. Okay, questions so far before I dive in with a little background on the Book of Kings? We're good? All right. Please feel free to jump in at any time. It's quite all right. I don't need to monologue here. Okay, so there are two books of Kings, 1st and 2nd Kings, or Kings 1 and Kings 2. They were actually originally one book. It got sometime around probably the Septuagint got split into two. What goes on in the Book of Kings, it is predominantly about kings. It relates the history of Israel from the declining days of King David, so about the 10th century BCE, think about the year 1000 BCE, through the beginning of the Babylonian exile, which is an easy date that everyone should remember, 586 BCE. So about, 400-ish years of history in one book. It's now split into two. In terms of the sort of arc of that narrative, we begin at the beginning of the Book of Kings with the monarchy united under King David. The rule of Israel passes to his son Solomon, and much of the first Book of Kings follows King Solomon's reign. After Solomon, the monarchy splits, the kingdom splits into northern and southern kingdoms. The northern kingdom was called Israel, and the southern kingdom called Judah. From this point on, all the way through the rest of the books of Kings, you get this kind of synchronistic, side-by-side overlapping history of the divided monarchy. Covers about almost 2 centuries down through the destruction of the northern kingdom. So the northern kingdom got destroyed by the Assyrian Empire in the year 722. And then the text just covers what happened to Judah alone, since that was the only remaining Israelite kingdom, down through Babylonian exile in 586. Now, I called this a history, but it's really not a history in our contemporary sense of the word, trying to be a factual description of what actually happened. It's really like an extended theological essay, and it was written by either a person or more than one person who had a real agenda, who had passionately held beliefs about God's role vis-a-vis Israel and the Jewish people, who was convinced that the destruction of the northern kingdom and the eventual fall of the southern kingdom were due to the misguided policies of the kings. Basically, the stuff that people, and especially the kings, did wrong, brought about God's wrath and led to those nations' downfall. And so events are described selectively. Just because it's not in there doesn't mean it didn't happen. It definitely deliberately chooses what to highlight, what not to highlight. And as it does so, it comments and summarizes all these events and tries to kind of illustrate them as lessons, that explain what eventually happened with the downfall of the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. I'll get into the specific background of our Haftarah reading in a moment, but questions in general about the Book of Kings, the united or divided monarchy, any things like that. We've covered this book before, so if you're a veteran of Haftarah studies, you may have heard some of this. But what questions do you have so far about broad context?
I don't think anything.
All right, very good. So our Haftarah selection, specifically, like I said, 2 Kings, chapter 4, verse 42 is where we're going to start. So we're already at the point in the story where the monarchy is divided, but the northern kingdom hasn't been destroyed yet. So we're in that part where there's sort of side-by-side, sort of synchronistic history. The 2 Kings begins with the death of the prophet Elijah. So you probably heard Elijah, famous from the Passover Seder. He and his protege Elisha. So there's Elijah and Elisha. We're going to be talking about Elisha today. his protege Elisha literally takes up his mantle. Like literally, Elijah is said to be like sucked up in a whirlwind into heaven. He's one of two biblical characters who doesn't die. And his mantle, his cloak is on the ground, and Elisha literally picks it up and becomes the new prophet in Israel. So this whole section of 2 Kings focuses on Elisha, who was active for a period of about 50 years, between about 850 and the year 800, active in the northern kingdom prior to the destruction. He's the subject of a lot of folk tales, whereas later prophets are what they call literary prophets. So the ones who have their name on their book, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Amos, those guys. Elijah and Elisha are still prophets, but they call them non-literary prophets. They don't have their own book. Evidently, people wrote about them, but they didn't write themselves. So Elisha, there's a lot of tales told about him, and a lot of miracles ascribed to him. The stories are presented in these kind of cycles where it'll sort of tell some history and then take a break and tell a series of stories about Elisha. And it'll tell some more history of the kingdoms and then take a break and tell some stories about Elisha. And they're different lengths. There are many, I think there's 15 stories about Elisha all told, which is actually, I think, more than Elijah himself. And before the story we're going to read about Elisha, we have stories just to give you a sense of the kind of miracles Elisha gets credited with. There's a miracle involving a jug of oil, like filling a jug of oil miraculously, resurrecting a boy who everyone thought had died, and making a poisoned pot of food edible to eat. So that's the kind of thing he was up to. That's what I have to say about Elisha. Questions or anything like that about Elisha before we jump in and start reading? All right, let's do it. Here we go. Let me arrange windows for just a moment. And the way I like to do this is to have participants be the readers. So could I get a volunteer to be our first reader and read source number 1 there, the first few verses of our Haftarah? Who would like it?
I don't mind reading.
Go ahead. Thanks, Tali.
Go ahead.
Oh, am I going to read?
Oh, it's Lynn. Sorry. I thought it was Tali. Yeah, go ahead, Lynn.
No sweat. A man came from Baal Shalisha, and he brought the man of God some bread of the first reaping, 20 loaves of barley bread, and some fresh grain in his sack. And Elisha said, "Give it to the people and let them eat." His attendant replied, "How can I set this before 100 men?" But he said, "Give it to the people and let them eat. For thus said the Lord, they shall eat and have some left over." So he set it before them, and when they had eaten, they had some left over, as the Lord had said.
Okay. So don't worry about Baal Shalisha. It's a town in the tribe of Ephraim. The title "Man of God" is one we hear fairly frequently throughout the books of Kings, about Elisha and Elijah as well. Clearly, when it says "Man of God," it's talking about Elisha. Although interestingly, that the only mention of Elisha by name in this little section is parenthetical. Basically, the translation puts it in there because this is within a whole bunch of stories about Elisha. That said, his name is not explicitly mentioned here. This is an entire story. Like I said, there are a lot of stories about Elisha, but this is like a self-contained little mini Elisha story that's only 3 verses long. So what happens, it seems like a guy comes and brings Elisha a gift of some kind. That makes sense. Prophets evidently commonly received gifts for their services. They would give oracles and do divination and things like that. And that was sort of how they got paid for their work. This particular miracle, does it sound familiar? Margaret's laughing, so tell me why you're laughing, Margaret.
Is it all right to mention the New Testament?
He was one of ours, right? So why not?
He was a Jewish bastard who made good.
Oh, he was fine. He was a fine guy.
Allegedly,
he's pretty successful though. Yeah, absolutely.
He fed the multitude with what was it? 2 loaves and 5 fish. Nowhere near enough. And then when they were through, it took 22 baskets to pick up the leftovers.
Good. So yes, this definitely reminds me of the Jesus miracle story, right? Of feeding a lot of people with just a little bit of food. Now, I don't know that there's like a direct connection here, but it's clearly thematically very similar. I have a book that I think could highlight this, but it's in my office and I haven't been in there I wasn't in there over the weekend with the wherewithal to check it out. But I have a version of the New Testament called the Jewish Annotated New Testament that is, it's the New Testament, but commented on from the perspective of basically a Jewish reader. And so it pulls out all of the, it highlights all the connections between the New Testament, its allusions to the Hebrew Bible, things like that. So I'm curious to go check the loaves and fishes story to see if there's a link back to this, if maybe, scholars of the New Testament think that's a deliberate allusion to this Elisha story. I don't know, so I can't really say much more about that.
Yeah, I think there's a few things in here that put this in a very Jewish context, though. When he calls Elisha Ish HaElohim.
Right, man of God.
Right, that's what Moses is often called. So it just puts us in that framework of somebody who has a very profound connection with Hashem. And then when he talks about the 20 loaves of barley bread from the new harvest, the first reaping, well, that puts us just a few weeks before where we are now when we started counting the Omer, because the first reaping is of barley.
Yeah, very good. So actually, yeah, that does serve to sort of locate this story within the time of the year.
Right.
Definitely.
And also within the kind of ebb and flow of Jewish life, being agricultural.
Right,
yeah.
Right. And of course, this is before the construction of the temple.
Right.
No, I'm sorry. Wait, this is after this. The temple has already existed. Solomon built it. The temple is in Jerusalem, but this is also a northern story because Elisha is the prophet of the north. So I don't know. I'm not totally sure how that interacts with
yeah, but don't people from the north go to the temple too?
I think so. I think there was also some thought that they went to there was sort of a northern counterpart of the temple as well. But in any case, there's not a lot of detail on the sort of skeleton of the story, right? Right.
But there'd probably be some kind of korban, some kind of offering of their barley at wherever they go to give
right. And so but it's tough to say, is this that, or is this connected with that, or is this something different?
Well, I mean, it's just an allusion to the time of year and
right. So
in the place.
So I mentioned that these are miracle stories, right? So what exactly is the miracle? You get my meaning?
Yeah.
What I'm asking, what exactly is the miracle? What does Elisha do?
Well, there didn't seem like there'd be enough food for everybody and there was leftovers.
Okay.
But he doesn't say I did it. He invokes the name of Hashem.
Good. So it doesn't say he did any sort of multiplication of the food, right?
He's just says, okay. The miracle, right. Attributed it to God rather than to his power.
Right. So when I ask what is the miracle, it doesn't actually say, I think that the temptation is to read this as, 20 loaves of barley somehow became 100, but it doesn't actually say that. Somehow they just 100 men ate 20 loaves and had some left over still. So the miracle really is in God's promise that's fulfilled, which is also kind of ambiguous too. So Elisha says, give it to the people and let them eat, because God said they shall eat and have some left over. that is not a quote that we know from anywhere else in Tanakh. So whatever source this, wherever this story about Elisha comes from, whatever it was that Elisha is referring to, we kind of don't know. We don't know when God said that. It's not recorded anywhere else. This sort of highlights a little bit the folktale character of some of these. Like this could be like if this story was not located in the context it was in, sandwiched in between stories about Elisha, this could kind of be a story about anybody, right? Because there's no names mentioned explicitly. It's somebody prophetic, but so this is sort of characteristic of a lot of these Elisha stories, and we'll see the rest of the Haftarah is one long story. We'll see some of these kind of folktale kind of characteristics coming up again.
It seems to me to increase the mystery of the whole story and also of the ways of Hashem by having it ambiguous.
Sure, and I think also it reflects the approach of the author, the approach of the editor who brought these stories together, sort of saying this is an important story, but it's also not like important enough to preserve, and like kind of builds up the picture of Elisha as a character, but also is not, sort of, it's not a sort of fully fleshed out story. It's like kind of a little tidbit about Elisha. I think it does help us kind of, get some sense of who Elisha is a little bit. What sort of impressions do you have of Elisha so far, just from this story?
Elisha seems pretty confident.
Confident? You mean like in the sense of being sort of the real deal, like he's as a prophet?
Not worried. Just
confident. Oh, okay. I thought you said competent, like good at his job.
Okay.
But confident, sure, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, he just sort of says, turn around and give it away, right? Give it to the people.
A sense of faithfulness. Okay.
In that he sort of trusts that this will work, that this will come true.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anything else?
Well, he's compassionate in wanting to give it to the people.
Sure. Yeah, compassionate is maybe one word for that. I wrote down magnanimous, maybe. Like I think in theory, this is food that he himself is entitled to. Like this is a present for him, but he doesn't hold on to it.
It might also be hi, Rabbi. It might also be a thing of practicality. I mean, understanding that to have followers, there needs to be, you give you give me your time, you give me your energy, you give me your devotion, and there is rewards at the end of that.
It's sort of like almost like a dividend or something like that for his followers. Is that what you're suggesting?
Yeah, almost.
I mean, it's really interesting too, because it doesn't say. It says give it to the people. But who are these people? Where did they come from? Where even are they right now? They're evidently all assembled in such a way that they can eat, but we don't know who they are or where they come from. It's like really, it's really ambiguous. But I think it is like it's supposed to be just sort of like a thumbnail sketch in order to give us exactly that impression that like Elisha's the real deal prophet. He's not in this to like get rich or wealthy or whatever. His heart's in the right place. He gives away gifts and refuses to take for himself. And for that reason, it's worth it, maybe worth it to follow him or worth it to believe, in him as the representative of God, prophetic representative. Yeah. Okay.
The chapters before this don't give any hint of the history of this or where the people were or what was happening with them.
So there's no group of people assembled at this stage. There's it's right before this is another story. Basically, like I said, it was about Elisha neutralizing a poison in a pot
Oh,
There was, basically there was famine in the land, and the disciples of the prophets were sitting before him, and he said to his servant, set the large pot on the fire and cook a stew. And like someone goes out and picks a bunch of wild like gourds and things. And they didn't know what they were. Like, I guess they didn't know if these were poisonous or not. And while they're eating, someone figures it out that like, oh, these are actually poisonous. And they're like, oh, we shouldn't be eating this. And Elisha gets some flour and throws it in there and says, serve it up, let the people eat. And he somehow had like, that act somehow neutralized whatever poison was in the pot. Like, it's very ambiguous. But, and again, that's sort of totally in a vacuum. We don't know, who these people were or what they were doing together.
But there was a famine?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, so that's what the story has.
Mm-hmm.
But within the sort of arc of the whole book, this is, it doesn't say what year it is. Like, there's no way to date it, to date the story. There were other famines recorded other times, but there's no way to sort of anchor this to one of those points.
Yeah.
What I'm getting at is from a critical perspective, trying to think of what were the sources that the editor of Kings brought together. They probably had this sort of body of Elisha folklore that may have been somewhat written down, maybe somewhat oral, that they brought together kind of in this collection. And so the stories may have come from a lot of different times and a lot of different places, but he's sort of, the editor's kind of bringing them together here to sort of help us, piece together the biography of Elisha as a person, as a prophet. Okay, let's get into the sort of real, the meat of this Haftarah, and the story that's going to take up the rest of our study together. So it begins at the beginning of chapter 5. And could I get a volunteer to read? It's labeled source number 2 there, the first 7 verses of this story.
Can do it.
All right, go ahead.
Naaman, commander of the army of the king of Aram, was important to his lord and high in his favor. For though him the Lord had granted victory for Aram.
Through him, yeah.
Oh, sorry. But the man, though a great warrior, was a leper. Once when the Arameans were out raiding, they carried off a young girl from the land of Israel, and she became an attendant to Naaman's wife. She said to her mistress, I wish master would come before the prophet of Samaria. He would cure him of his leprosy. Naaman went and told his lord just what the girl from the land of Israel had said. And the king of Aram said, go to the king of Israel, and I will send along a letter. He set out, taking with him 10 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, and 10 changes of clothing. He brought the letter to the king of Israel. It read, now when this letter reaches you, know that I have sent my courtier Naaman to you, that you may cure him of his leprosy. When the king of Israel read the letter, he rent his clothes and cried, am I God to deal death or give life, that this fellow writes to me to cure a man of leprosy? Just see for yourselves that he is seeking a pretext against me.
Okay, thank you, Tali. Okay, so a lot going on here. Let's see if we can unpack and figure out what's going on. So first, Naaman, who is the commander of the army of the king of Aram. So Aram is basically, think Syria, sort of northeast of the land of Israel, and kind of traditional long-running foe, sort of on again, off again enemy of Israel. And it says, but the man, though a great warrior, was a leper. So 2 things. One, we have the same issue with the story already, in that even though we have Naaman who is, named, it doesn't say the name of the king of Aram. It also later doesn't say the name of the king of Israel. So it's essentially impossible, like the story is placed here in kind of a vacuum among a bunch of other Elisha stories. So we can sort of guess who these are. But again, it sort of seems like this is an Elisha story, maybe from another context, lifted and put here. It kind of doesn't matter to the point of the story who the king was, who the kings were, or when exactly this happened. It's about something, about something bigger than that, basically. We also don't know, is this young Elisha going to be involved in the story? Is this towards the end of his career? We don't know any of that. And kind of telegraphs that this is a bit of a folktale. Like I said, Aram is Syria. Naaman, interestingly, comes from a root means pleasantness in Hebrew, and says he was a leper. Now, again, this is the translation, probably slightly mistranslating. The Hebrew there is Metzorah, just like the name of the Torah portion. Metzorah has to do with tzara'at, that kind of scaly skin disease. Evidently this guy had some kind of dermatological problem, but it didn't disfigure him or disqualify him from high military office, interestingly. Okay, and then they encounter this young girl from Israel.
Yeah. I'm just thinking that the leprosy in the Bible, the person who had it was, am I right that they were put outside?
Yeah.
They were kind of isolated, and here he's a warrior.
Yeah. Right. So that comes up later in the story, which is why I'm not addressing it immediately, but you're absolutely right. So in Parashat Tazria and Parashat Metzorah, it's a lot about that. Someone who contracted this tzara'at, which we can call it leprosy, even though it's definitely not leprosy. It was considered like it was escape. So it was probably unpleasant for them and for others, but not necessarily like permanently disfiguring or necessarily like a terminal illness. It was associated with ritual impurity. And so a lot of the cure was to basically just wait for it to go away and then do a purification ritual, which is mostly just to bring them back into a state of ritual purity. I think there's an interesting sort of anthropological read on this, like how is leprosy handled in Aramea versus in the land of Israel, and I don't know enough to do that. This is an Israel story, so I think when we read that this guy was a leper, I think just like you're saying, Leah, we're supposed to read all the things that we learn to think about tzara'at from Torah onto this guy. Okay, so they meet this young girl, right? Who's evidently captured in a raid, who becomes the servant of Naaman's wife. The girl tells the mistress, "Oh, I wish he could come to Samaria." Samaria is Israel; it's the northern kingdom, and come see the prophets who would cure him. And it doesn't say how Naaman finds out, but evidently the wife tells Naaman, and he goes and tells the king what this enslaved girl says, and the king is like, "Great, go to Israel. I'll send you a note, a hall pass or whatever," and sends him with 10 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, and 10 changes of clothing. Does anyone want to guess how much gold and silver that is in modern units? How many pounds do you think?
Well, the gold is very heavy.
Yes. So a talent is more than a shekel. Evidently 10 talents of silver, a conservative estimate in modern units would be at least 660 pounds of silver, and 6,000 shekels of gold is about 158 pounds of gold. So a lot. That seems like a lot to me. I don't know, but
so he'd need an entourage.
Yeah, he would definitely need a whole entourage of people to help carry that much, definitely. And 10 changes of clothing, which is interestingly, I think we can probably presume that that's like very fine royal clothing. Clothing would have been expensive in those days. Like any person basically wore 2 sets of clothing all year. You'd wear one and then throw it away halfway through the year and wear another one, and that's what you wore the whole year. So 10 changes of clothing seems like a lot.
But also when you have tzara'at, you're supposed to get rid of your clothing.
Good.
So, yeah.
Right. So interestingly, that doesn't totally come up in the story, but that is part of what we learn about it in Torah, that you take off your clothing and dispose of it as part of the purification ritual. So it's possible it has something to do with that. but
you know,
that's
even
been the last time it's mentioned.
Yeah, when you have a skin disease, there's a good chance it's draining all over your clothes, and you'd want to change them more frequently than usual.
Right, right. So yeah, so the clothing doesn't come up again, but I think those are all plausible interpretations of why that's included. And then, so Naaman shows up in Israel. He brings a letter to the king, and it says, "When this letter reaches you, know that I've sent my courtier Naaman to you, that you can cure him of leprosy." And then what does the king of Israel do? He freaks out, right? Why does he freak out?
He's like, I can't do that.
Yeah. Why is this foreign king asking me to cure a guy of leprosy? Right?
Because he's concerned he'll be seen as weak if he can't cure him.
Sure, something like that. He reads this as a setup somehow, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, why is he asking me for, like, so I can, obviously there's no way I can do this. I'm gonna fail. Now maybe have a pretext against me, maybe to invade, like, oh, you failed to cure my something like that.
Right.
So does it strike you at all as weird that the king doesn't know about Elisha? Because who else knows about Elisha?
Well, maybe he does know about Elisha, but he didn't even think about it yet.
Maybe. But who definitely does know about Elisha?
Elisha. And the girl.
Right?
Who was captured, yeah.
Good. So a young girl seems to know about Elisha and his miracle working properties. Definitely either the king is too panicked to think about it or somehow doesn't, which is peculiar.
Also, the servant, or the person who gave him the bread earlier in the reading would have known.
The person who gave him, the man from Baal Shalisha?
Yeah.
Well, he knew he was a man of God.
But he knew that it didn't seem like there'd be enough bread, and it was like miraculous to him that there was enough and extra.
Yes.
And also earlier in the book of Kings, there are other Elisha stories. We're just coming in the middle. So he's probably known in kind of folk stories by the people.
Okay, so yes, evidently he is known by the people. If so, why does the king not know about that? Right? So what I'm saying is this is a peculiar detail of this particular story. It sort of sets up the drama of the story, right? Because otherwise the king would just be like, oh, here's Elisha. Everything is wrapped up in a neat little package, but the king doesn't do that and says.
But when we see the next sentence, Elisha's going to the king. He wouldn't have access to the king so easily unless the king was familiar with him.
Right, which is why it's peculiar that the king doesn't know about Elisha.
No, I'm not saying he doesn't know about him. He just isn't thinking about him for this particular purpose.
Okay. So yeah, I mean, so yes, like, but that's like the drama of the story is the king is in a panic, and sort of Elisha is set up as the guy to come save the day then, because the king thinks this is a setup and maybe a pretext for war. Okay.
Well, that's how so many folk tales or even children's stories work. The guy who's in charge is not so as in charge as one would expect. And it's somebody from the folk who is able to step up and save the day. Good.
So that's exactly what I'm getting at. And as we, when we come back later to sort of talk about what are the themes of this, maybe how does this, how did this speak to people at the time and through centuries since, keep that in mind. Keep that in mind. Okay, so we have the setup for the drama. Let's go ahead and read another bit. There it is. Okay, who would like to read source number 3? Another 5 verses.
I'll step up.
Go for it, Nathan. Thank you.
When Elisha, the man of it's Elisha, right?
Yeah.
Okay. When Elisha, the man of God, heard that the king of Israel had rent his clothes, he sent a message to the king. Why have you rent your clothes? Let him come to me, and he will learn that there is a prophet in Israel. So Naaman came with his horses and chariots and halted at the door of Elisha's house. Elisha sent a messenger to say to him, "Go and bathe 7 times in the Jordan, and your flesh shall be restored, and you shall be clean." But Naaman was angered and walked away. "I thought," he said, "he would surely come out to me and would stand and invoke the Lord his God by name, and would wave his hand towards the spot and cure the affected part. Are not the Amana and the Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than all the waters of Israel? I could bathe in them and be clean." And he stalked off in a rage.
All right. So Naaman arrives at Elisha's house, and this is sort of all. There's some of this seems to be conducted through a messenger, which sort of tracks with across the Elisha stories. Elisha, over and above other prophets, seems to do a lot of his communicating with other people, even when it's like delivering prophecies. Elisha tends to work through messengers. He sort of sends his servants to do things for him. I don't totally know what to make of that. I'm just noting that is a commonality across Elisha stories. What is the prescription here for how he's going to get cured of his tzara'ats?
He has to bathe 7 times in the Jordan.
Okay, very good. Okay, so 2 questions. One, why 7? And why the Jordan? Or maybe why water, more specifically, or more generally?
In the rules about being unclean, usually it was to wash, change their clothes, be outside the camp until sunset, and then they could come back. Good.
And that's after actually already, like after the affliction has already like gone away. That's the ritual for purification.
Yeah.
That's right. Good. So in terms of why water, water was seen as having the power to remove ritual impurity. It's a difficult kind of concept to get modern heads around. You can sort of think about it like spiritual gunk. I think cooties are a good analogy because they're transmitted by contact. Someone or something unclean that touches another someone or something transmits that, just like the way cooties on the playground.
But I think too, tza'arat was often seen as a spiritual disease, as something caused by lashon hara, speaking evil.
Good.
And water 7 times, perhaps this is like a mikveh, where you go and immerse and you come out with a new spiritual wholeness. And as far as 7, that's the number we see throughout Torah, which means heavenly completion. Something is finished. It's done. Good. He's been able to release the negativity. Yeah, the spiritual.
Good. Yes.
Yeah.
So I want to caution against reading later rabbinic concepts like mikveh back into much more ancient stories, but clearly that's what's going on here. That concept of water as purifying, not even just cleansing, but like purifying.
Right.
Is potent. Yeah.
And also the mikveh has its source in places like this too. It's not something that the rabbis automatically made up, but they drew from these times in history too. Some of perhaps the folk tales, but yeah, water is often it's the life-giving source for us.
Right. So, and yes, and you also responded to my other question about why 7. So as Margaret I think noted, like usually the ritual for purification involves essentially one immersion in water. One every time it says bathe, I think that's like one dunk is what we're supposed to imagine here. But Elisha's prescription is 7, which is, it sounds like it's on purpose. 7 it's what they call a typological number. You could also call it a magical number. There are a lot of things that come in 7s. Can you think of any other sort of magical 7s in the Torah. So Amy mentioned the days of creation, which is clearly sort of what this is all rooted back in. Can you think of any others?
Oh, there's so many.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
How about Joshua at the Battle of Jericho? Circled around the city 7 times, and what happened? The walls came tumbling down, right? So yes.
So we count the Omer for 7 weeks.
7 by 7, yeah. 7,
yeah. The Shemitah, the land is laid fallow or farmed for 7 years. The 7th year, they let it be fallow. Yep. The 7th times 7th year is a whole year. Yeah.
Sure. Right. So good. So basically, there's 7s all throughout Torah, and so yeah. So this is a prescription to go and bathe, but in almost a I don't know, maybe a more comprehensive way, something like that. It's not. He doesn't say just go dunk once. The 7 times seems to be crucial.
I also remember I did a little bit of research on this. I remember it started something having to do with numerology and how it was, an indivisible number. Sure. And
yeah,
some attachment to mysticism.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. I think that they understood 7 and the idea, even if they might not have called it a prime number like we would, they would have sort of understood the way it's special, right? That it can't be divided.
It's kind of like
a
perfectly balanced
right. 7 is perfectly right. Very good.
However, now Aman, coming from another culture, might not have been as fluent in the 7s. He might not have seen the significance of what that could have meant. And
yeah, and I don't know enough about study of ancient Aram to know what he might have thought, but it's entirely possible. He certainly reacts, in a somewhat strange way, right? He gets angry.
Yeah.
He also seems to have some sort of sense of superiority about the rivers of his homeland versus the rivers of Jordan.
Sure, right?
Like, you have a crap river. My river is way wetter than yours.
Right. Okay, good.
What the thing is going on there.
Good. Okay, so in terms of what this tells us about Naaman as a character, he's I don't know, what would you say, a patriot or I
say he's a warrior.
A lawyer?
Warrior. He's a
soldier.
If they don't like to take orders, they want to do battle. That's their mode.
Okay. So do I hear in your comments that Naaman's anger comes from the fact that he's receiving orders from Elisha?
Well, that kind of comes from the same place that you're talking about. It just comes from a place of pride.
Yeah.
Okay.
Exactly. Yeah.
So pride for his homeland, his country, right?
Yeah, he's not just one of the folk coming and saying, "Oh, wonderful, Elisha, right. Can you help me?" He's strutting in here with this entourage of chariots and horses and all kinds of clothing, and he has in mind what he wants. Yeah, and Elisha better deliver.
Well,
so he says that I thought he would come out and do something dramatic, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I thought he would invoke the Lord by name and wave his hand and cure the affected spark. And he's like, couldn't I just gone and taken a bath back in Aram, back in Damascus? Like, this is not. So is he just mad about the sort of having to make this trip to hear that all he needs to do is a bath, or is there something else that's maybe, I don't know, frustrating or upsetting him? Because I'm sensing one other thing here.
Well, partly he feels he's been snubbed because he didn't even come out. He just sent word.
Okay. I think that's about. I did not think of that, but I think totally.
He had a messenger to say, "Go." He didn't even come out in person.
Right. He doesn't even get to talk to the guy. Right.
Yeah.
To talk to. Okay. So very possible. I think combination. So far, we sort of have this combination of. He made the trip just to go dunk in a river that we have back home, and also I didn't even get to talk to the boss. I didn't even get to talk to the prophet himself. There's still something else though that I think may be making Naaman upset.
I think he thought Elisha would call God to the scene and make it happen.
Okay, and instead what happened?
Or for all we know, he just came out. He came out and told him what to do. For all we know, he might have had a time where he was communicating with God, but it just isn't apparent.
You mean Elisha was communicating with God?
Right. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yes. But I think what Lynn was saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, Lynn, that Naaman is sort of expected to see it.
Right.
He sort of expected it to happen in front of him.
Yeah, I'm not disagreeing. I'm just saying maybe it did happen, but it seems like Naaman is being humbled in some way.
Humbled. Okay.
Humiliated would be another way to look at it from his perspective.
Okay. How is this a humiliating experience for Naaman? We already said the sort of communicating through a messenger.
Right.
That it. What, if anything else?
Well, he expected more to do about him.
Okay. So, does anyone relate to this? Because I kind of think that I do. So it seems like Naaman is, this has sort of been built up in his mind as like the big moment, right? The big moment, and like maybe we can imagine he's had this skin affliction for who knows how long, maybe his whole life, and like this is the moment where he's finally going to be rid of it. He's like looking forward to some kind of big dramatic payoff, and Elisha says, go take a bath. And that somehow, even though that is going to get him what he wants, it's frustrating. It's not the sort of big to do that he wanted.
Well, if he had come
that
out,
actually kind of heralds back to I'm sorry, that kind of heralds back to it's not really an insult, but it kind of is. Back where I'm from, back out east, when you say somebody, go take a shower, it means, go pound sand, go
sure,
do something else, stop bothering me.
Okay, I can see that. Margaret, what were you going to suggest?
If he had come out and performed a ritual, it would have been in front of all of the man's servants. It would have been very public.
Okay.
Everybody would know he had been so honored to be cured in that matter. And just going off and immersing himself in the river isn't nearly as spectacular.
Sure. So actually, now that makes me think of something else too, that like, not only is Naaman, sort of let down by the lack of showmanship here, but also maybe this says something else about Elisha as a character, as a prophet. Like he could have done a big to-do, right? And he chose not to instead. Maybe perhaps to sort of keep the spotlight off of him and keep the spotlight on God or something like that. I think that's very possible. Okay. Let's read the conclusion. Could I get a volunteer to read the last section there, source number 4? Someone who hasn't read yet, maybe?
But his servants came forward and spoke to him. Sir, they said, if the prophet told you to do something difficult, would you not do it? How much more when he has only said to you, bathe and be clean? So he went down and immersed himself in the Jordan 7 times, as the man of God had bidden, and his flesh became like a little boy's, and he was clean. Returning with his retinue to the man of God, he stood before him and exclaimed, now I know there is no God in the whole world except in Israel. So please accept a gift from your servant. But he replied, as the Lord lives, whom I serve, I will not accept anything. He pressed him to accept, but he refused. And Naaman said, then at least let your servant be given 2 mule loads of earth. For your servant will never again offer up burnt offering or sacrifice to any god except the Lord. But may the Lord pardon your servant for this. When my master enters the temple of Rimmon to bow low and worship there, and he is leaning on my arm so that I must bow low in the temple of Rimmon. When I bow low in the temple of Rimmon, may the Lord pardon your servant in this. And he said, Lech l'shalom, go to your peace. Go in peace.
Good. All right. Thank you, Amy. So how do you understand the servant's advice? They say, if the prophet told you to do something difficult, would you not do it? How much more when he has only said to you, bathe and be clean? Can someone rephrase that in a way that makes more sense to me?
Just for clarification, this is Elisha's servant?
No, this is Naaman's servants.
Okay.
Are the ones talking to Naaman.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So can someone say that in their own words? What are the servants trying to tell him to do? Or trying to what are they saying to him?
Well, basically they're saying it's not going to cost you anything. You've come all this way. Why not do it?
Like give it a shot, right?
Yeah.
Like just because he didn't make a big show about it, do you think that means it's not going to work, or that you shouldn't do it? Like he told you to do something that's actually really easy. So like go take a bath, man. Go in a positive way, Nathan, not in a negative way, right? If he had told you to do something difficult, like he could have told you to, I don't know, jump up and down one foot and pat your head and rub your tummy while he recited incantations or something. He didn't tell you to do that. He just told you to go bathe. So why not go ahead and do that?
Something to consider, not to take the majesty out of the story, but from a public health conscious sort of perspective.
Okay.
A person who is afflicted with a disease like leprosy that doesn't regularly clean or shower or let alone bathe could probably do with a means of cleansing the body and cleaning of bacteria and cleaning of any
probably not going to
spoiled
hurt
tissues that need to be rubbed off.
Mm-hmm. For sure. Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. Clearly that the water is seen as having like apotropaic, like it's spiritually rejuvenating powers, but it's also just good to be clean. Good. Okay. I'm curious if anyone can think of it, has had any sort of parallel experiences to Naaman, sort of expecting a big to do and then kind of being disappointed that something was easier than it was made out to be.
I feel like the pandemic has definitely felt that way, and that at the beginning of when we can all get together again, it's gonna be so fun, and we'd have this big party, and now it's just this kind of like staged, awkward, messy rollout.
I mean, yes, and I also that was actually sort of what I thought too. And this is sort of relates to when we'll talk in a few moments, kind of going back over all of this and how it speaks to us today. But I kind of relate to Naaman, being told all he has to do is go bathe, because I think it is kind of like the whole mask wearing, precaution thing. It's like, really, that's it. That's all I got to do is like wear the piece of cloth. Like that's both so easy to do, and it's like, modern science is supposed to have all sorts of miracle, crazy technological cures for stuff. And what's actually really effective is just wearing a piece over your mouth. And it's like, yeah, that is kind of a letdown, isn't it? Like, I thought it was going to be more dramatic than this or something like that. And I think, I suspect there may be some kind of psychological impulse at work there too, that makes people resist that. They're like, oh, it's too simple. It can't really be real. It can't really work. It makes them not want to do the masking or things like that. I don't know. I had that same kind of thought, that it's I relate to this because of pandemic a little bit. All right, let's touch on a couple of other little details. Here's another detail that I don't think I totally understand. His skin. He went down immersed and his flesh became like a little boy's. What do you think that means? I couldn't find any commentaries that tried to explain that.
Oh, baby skin. Oh, go ahead, Nathan.
I was going to say, it probably refers to a renewing. Probably with a disease like that, he probably doesn't have any body hair.
So is that what it is? Does it mean he's hairless?
That's what I would assume. If he has a
okay.
disease like leprosy, then he doesn't have the same sort of integumentary glands and oil production glands and things like that most people would, which would lead to probably a lack of follicle growth.
Well,
okay, so this is why I bring you guys together for this kind of thing, because
this is entirely speculation. I
like
had
it.
a patient with leprosy.
That tracks though.
But it does track with a patient that has a severe skin condition, like people who have deep scar tissue or burns. They never grow hair back in that same area because of how deeply it affects the tissues of the body.
That makes sense. So I was going back and forth. Like, is this a detail? Am I supposed to connect, like, be connecting this to something? Is this alluding to something else that I understand? And I think it may just be that it's trying to say his skin was really smooth and maybe hairless.
As a warrior, he have collected a series of scars.
That's also a very good point.
Yeah, sure. Okay. Thank you for that. And let's close it out by talking about Naaman's conversion. Is it if it is in fact a conversion? What do you think? What do you make of Naaman's sort of statements at the end, where he ends up with all this? Bye, Lynn. Thank you.
Well, I noticed that it kind of references the fact that at the point in time, the God of Israel was still a local deity and was not considered by and large the God of the world and the universe and existence.
Okay.
But specifically the God of Israel.
Right. So you're getting there from that. You're getting there from that. Now I know there's no God in the whole world except in Israel. Okay. Yeah. Definitely. And even though Israelites may have understood God to be the God of the whole world, there's no real reason to expect that other civilizations with their gods would have had the same impression. Good. Okay, so he definitely seems to understand and accept, Elisha and Israel's radical monotheism, right? But he sort of makes there's a couple of caveats, maybe you would say, right? He asked for 2 loads of dirt to take back with him. Why do you think he asked for dirt?
So he could worship the God of Israel on the land of Israel. Because in his mind, God is still tied to land.
Good, yes. So is he really fully accepting God, the God of Israel, is really the God of the whole world? Maybe not quite, right? If he still thinks there's
able. I mean, he's got, a lifetime background of focusing on God being localized. It's hard to accept completely all at once.
Yeah, which I think makes this story really interesting. Like, this is never really cited as a story of a conversion to Judaism. If we look for a story to relate to about that, we look to the book of Ruth, right? Ruth and Naomi, and your God shall be my God, and your people will be my people. Like, that's the story that we sort of point to as the Bible's first conversion story, not this one. And I wonder if that has to do with it, because he sort of doesn't really get, it seems, the God is really there really are no other gods. Like, God is the God of everything. And it's, the connection to the land, like, yes, this is a chosen, God's the chosen land for God's treasured people, but that doesn't mean that God isn't in Aram too, right?
Yeah, he just probably can't, like Margaret said, can't wrap around that, because God is associated with a place,
right?
And he can do wonders to anybody in this place, but is he really that big that it's the whole world?
Right.
I mean, this is radical thinking.
Yeah, definitely, and I'm sure would have been really, both figuratively and literally foreign to him. But despite sort of not getting all the way there, I don't feel like the story sort of paints him as, a fool or anything like that. Like, it's actually kind of sympathetic to Naaman, I feel like.
Yeah.
Like, he sort of, ultimately he says, I want to take some earth back with me so I can worship back there. And then and just so you know, I'm still going to have to accompany my master to the temple of Rimon. Rimon, apparently, according to commentary, is like an alternate name for the Aramean storm god, also called Hadad. Basically, so he knows he's going to have to continue to go, essentially act like a good Aramean. If he plans to go back home, which evidently does, he can't, be like, oh, I'm a worshiper of the God of Israel now. I can't do, Aramean worship anymore. And he sort of has to be let off the hook for that. He has to be forgiven for that. And Elisha says, okay, yeah, go in peace. You gotta do what you gotta do.
Yeah, and you're really shalom is more like go in harmony, go in wholeness. Like, right. Don't worry about it. And these stories are for us too, to remember that we can do what we can do, given where we live.
Yeah. So good. Let's go into the sort of the analysis and thinking about what this text says to us. One last note on this, that we sort of set up these whole Elijah as not accepting gifts, which he again doesn't do. He, despite that Naaman brought all that money, Elijah says no, thank you. And actually, the story, this is the end of what's in the Haftarah, but the story actually does continue a little bit. There's a little bit of an epilogue where Elisha's servant Gehazi goes and ends up getting the gifts anyway and brings them back, and Elisha obviously finds out, and then Gehazi gets tzara'at as punishment for that. But this is the part we're concerned about, because this is what's in the Haftarah. So let's sort of analyze across kind of three levels here. Let's imagine we are people who were around at the time that this was written. Bye, Amy. Good to see you. Oh, she already got. How might this text have spoken to folks at the time that it was written? Like, say this was a tale told about Elisha in 9th century Israel. What do you think you might have heard in it? How might this have spoken to you?
Well, apparently he was already known as a miracle worker.
Right.
It would have reinforced we were right all along.
Right. This is part of the mythology of Elisha or whatever. Yeah. Good.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So what happens with the king? Like, does the king just kind of stop caring once Naaman is sent to Elijah, or is he still kind of like, oh, someone's setting me up with something?
Doesn't say. Don't know. It goes on to the next story after that. I mean, the king of Aram does come up again, but because these are kind of separate literary units, there's no way to say for sure. Is that the same king of Aram from earlier? Like, they're not named. So I don't know. I mean, I think that may be sort of part of the kind of theme of the story. And maybe if I was an ancient Israelite like this, like what I would heard in this is sort of a story about how the people in high social status are dependent on people in lower social status. Like the two kings who have the highest status are the least consequential figures in all of this. Naaman, obviously, who is still fairly high status, is one of the only two named characters, him and Elisha. But Naaman is dependent on all kinds of people, obviously on Elisha, but he depends at various points on the advice of his servants. He depends on his wife. He depends on the reporting of an Israelite slave girl. Like, he would have lived and died his whole life with tzara'at if he hadn't depended on all those people who are way below his station.
I always wondered as a mean little kid.
Okay.
It says the girl said to go and talk to this prophet.
Okay.
And it says he repeated it exactly to the king, and the king disregards that and sends a message to the king instead of to the prophet. Do kings only talk to other kings?
Huh.
Or
yeah,
did he completely miss the point?
Maybe so. Yeah, maybe this is also sort of a story about the cluelessness of kings, sort of how out of touch they are with the folk, right? Because they don't know about Elijah. They're dependent on these stories and all they know how to do is send letters to one another. Yeah, maybe so. Okay, what do you think about reading this as a Haftarah? So this is, this got selected as the Haftarah to be read opposite Parashat Tazria. And I think the connection through Tzara'at, through skin disease, is pretty straightforward. But, say you were a Jew in a synagogue sometime over the last, 2,000 years, who heard this read, how might have this have spoke to you as a Jew in an earlier era?
That our God isn't bound to one little spot of ground. We certainly have sentiment towards Jerusalem and all, but God is, our God at least, is everywhere.
Good. Why would that maybe have been an important thing to reiterate?
It's important because, unlike every other group of people, when we got separated from the land, we still stayed Jews.
Sure.
Took various forms of the Torah with us.
Yeah.
And expanded it and stayed Jews all over the world.
Good. Yeah. The vast majority of Jews who would have read this would have been themselves outside the land of Israel, right? And to sort of hear in the story a non-Israelites say, like, yeah, I get it. God is the God of the whole world, and it doesn't matter, kind of doesn't matter where you are. He mostly gets it. I feel like, maybe it's sort of a kind of, I don't know, I would maybe hear validation or something like that in that, and like maintaining our, our connection to God and connection to the land of Israel, right? That, as folks were living in Europe and, all over, this is sort of a story about the land of Israel in some ways. Like it's kind of,
I feel like it also,
yeah, go ahead, Tali.
I was gonna say, I feel like it also speaks to that God is in all people as well as in all of the land. Like it's like in the story, it's like God is present in all like classes of people and not just like the king, like England was said to, be gods, whatever, but like God in this story is like throughout all levels of society.
Yeah, I really like that. I hadn't thought of that. Yeah, this could definitely have been a story that would have been really good to hear, like when you were struggling, like when Jews were struggling with relationships with with the peoples around them.
Yeah.
Like, here's a story about Israel and Aram actually like kind of getting along, I think. Like, don't worry that Aram took one of our children as slaves. Like, don't worry about it. And like at the end, I think this is sort of a story about them getting along.
Yeah.
Like maybe that would have been something important for people to hear. Maybe make them want to keep coming back to keep reading this. Interesting.
Well, I keep thinking, I don't know time-wise which way this goes, but the still small voice and, comparing it to, oh, this is the easy way. We don't have to make a big fanfare out of it.
Yeah.
And being willing to listen to that messenger, whether it's, you think it's hearing God or it's coming from other people.
Yeah. I really like that, Leah. Both, I think, for the, what I think others might have heard before me and what I can hear in this now, that like, yeah, I mean, for generations of Jews, they sort of had to watch as, the Christians around them got to build these giant cathedrals and the Muslims around them got to build these giant, elaborate mosques. And Jews, like, literally were not allowed to do that. And, you may have been in danger of sort of internalizing like our God isn't really all that powerful or is not, I don't know, maybe not real. But this is sort of a story about how that doesn't matter. That's not how God works. God isn't in the big flowery showmanship or the giant architecture. Like you said, God's in the still small voice. Like it happens because of simple things like bathing in a river that spiritual transformations happen. Yeah, I like that. I like that read. I think that speaks to me now too. That speaks to me now too. Any other thoughts about how is this text sitting with you today? We talked about the connection to pandemic, but what do you like or relate to in here?
Well, now I guess the counterpart is people who don't want to get the vaccine.
Oh, really? What the counterpart? Oh, you mean in terms of people, something
Not following directions.
Not following directions.
People are really good at not following directions.
Yeah.
It happens time after time after time in the Bible with
I mean,
souls. But
yeah, I wonder if there's something like that. Yeah, maybe this is also a sort of a story about human nature, or human behavior or something like that. Yeah, that's entirely possible. I like that too.
And maybe that's connected to how I feel like with the vaccine, it's like everyone, like it's a collective effort, and maybe like God is something that's meant to be experienced collectively and like worked collectively.
Yeah. It's certainly like in the sense of like being accessible collectively, or like accessible to anyone, no matter like Alicia, like sort of seems like it goes to great lengths to make this like not about him, right? By not being the one to make a big show, pronounce names of God, whatever. Yeah, I think that's an important message too. I like it. Thanks, friends. Nathan, we're wrapping up. We have gone plenty long. Thanks so much for learning with me this afternoon. That was a really great discussion. I'm gonna be sad to see these Haftarah studies go. If we want to do some more, there's plenty more. I'll continue to pick out the good ones and lift them up and bring them for you, because this is really fun.